Hello Year 11 and welcome to paper 3. So paper 3 is Germany, it's the modern depth study, so Weimar and Nazi Germany 1918 to 1939. It's going to be an hour and 20 minutes, and on the slide in front of you you can see the structure of the paper and how much time you should spend on each question. So just pause the video now, just take 2 minutes to read through so that you understand how long you need to spend on each question and what the question stems are. Question 1 is an inference question. This is a question that you should get full marks on because it does not require any own knowledge. My top tip for this question is to work from the bottom of the page up. So you underline the inquiry of the question. So you can see on the screen in front of you, you've got an example. The inquiry for this is give 2 things you can infer from source A about the treatment of Jews. So that's your inquiry. You look at your source. You find 2 phrases or 2 sentences that give you clues about the inquiry. So in this case, clues about the treatment of Jews, and then you write the details in first, because it is easier to make an inference from a detail than have an inference and then find a detail afterwards. And you can see that I've done that on the screen. So we've put the details in, the quotes in first. And then once you've written your details, again, you're going to work from the bottom of the page up so that the inference is in the right place. You're then going to make an inference from your detail. So the first detail I'd written in was with the bedroom door open, because I think that tells me something about the treatment of Jews. And my inference above that is the Jewish people were not treated with dignity. My second detail was the Nazis had a register. So then I would write my inference above that. And as you can see here, I think the Nazis had a register. The inference that I get is that the persecution was organised. So remember, work from the bottom up, put the details in first, and then add your inferences. The second style of question that you'll have is an explain why. We are very well practiced at this by now. It is exactly the same technique as you used in your medicine paper and your Elizabeth paper. So top tip is to make sure you've got a clear point, clear evidence, so show off with your facts, your names, your dates, and then your explanation using the words of the question in your answer. So if you read through the answer in front of you, I want you to look at where the point is, what evidence has been used, and see if you can identify where the explanation is. So just pause the video just for 2 minutes to read through that paragraph and find the point, the evidence, and the explanation. You will notice that the explanation uses the words of the question in the answer. So the question is, explain why Hitler was able to create a dictatorship in the period February 33 to August 1934. And if you look at the sections in bold, we have this helped Hitler to create a dictatorship because. This helped Hitler to create a dictatorship because. So just make sure that you are linking whatever facts you use back to the question. Once you've completed your inference question and your explain why question, you will then be looking at section B. Now section B will require you to use a booklet that has 2 sources in and 2 interpretations, and the questions in section B revolve around those 2 sources and 2 interpretations. All of the questions in section B will be on the same topic. So what that means is that you might feel like you're repeating yourself because you're using the same own knowledge in 2 different questions. That is fine. We would expect that. Each question is marked discreetly. So that means if you've used a fact for question 3A and you use the same fact for question 3D, you will be marked for both those answers. So please don't worry about using the same information in more than one question. So question 3A is a utility question. This is the same style that you did in medicine as well. And my top tip to you here is to make sure that you use contextual knowledge. So that means knowledge of the time in your answer. You're always going to start off with source B is useful for the inquiry because it is accurate. So learn that sentence. Then you go on to discuss the content. So it tells me that, and you summarize that in your own words. Then you bring in a quote, it says, or if it's a visual one, it shows. And then the key bit, year 11, is to write, this is accurate because I know that. And then you bring in any information that you have which matches the source, which proves that that source is accurate. So read through the response on your screen now and find where we have the judgment, the content, the contextual knowledge, that means the knowledge about the time, and find out where this person has written about provenance. So why the provenance of the source or the origin of the source makes it useful. So pause the video now for 2 minutes. Question 3b is another question that you will get full marks on. You do not need to use any own knowledge for this. This is all down to technique. So 3b asks you to study the two interpretations that you're given. And it asks you, what is the main difference between those views? So that requires you to read them both to decide what they're arguing and to decide how they're different. So this is how you would structure it. You would summarize the view of interpretation 1 first. So you would write, interpretation 1 argues that, and summarize what it's arguing in your own words. So in this case, interpretation 1 argues that significant groups of people did not support the Nazi regime. Then you need to make sure you quote from it. So in other words, why do you think it contains that argument? And you introduce that quote by writing, it says, and you find the sentence that proves your point. Then you're going to use the word however, because that word however shows that there is a difference between the two interpretations. However, interpretation 2 argues, and again you're going to summarize that in your own words, it says, bring in a quote to prove it. And that's it, that's all you have to do. So if you write interpretation 1 argues, summarize it, bring in a quote. However, interpretation 2 argues, summarize it, bring in a quote. That's going to get you 4 out of 4. If you don't put the quotes in, you only get 2 out of 4, which is a shame because you would have done the hard thinking anyway. So make sure tomorrow that you put your quotes in to get those extra 2 marks. So question 3c asks you why interpretations are different. And this is really logical because an interpretation is a historian's opinion about either an event or a time period. And historians form their opinions by looking at primary sources, by looking at sources from the time. So historians have different views because historians often have used different sources. So we're going to put that into our answer. And the first sentence in your answer is always going to be, the interpretations give different views because they have given weight to different sources. Or the interpretations give different views because they have used different sources. If you write that sentence on its own, that gets you 1 mark out of 4. But what we want to do is prove that those historians have used different sources. So what you do in your booklet, which has your 2 interpretations on one page and your 2 sources on the other, is you match them up. You find out which source says or shows the same thing as interpretation 1 and which source says or shows the same thing as interpretation 2. So if we put that into action, have a look at the screen. So the interpretations give different views because they have given weight to different sources. The writer of interpretation 1 argues that many did not conform and they may have used a source such as source B, because source B tells us that workers showed little interest in the Hitler nonsense. The writer of interpretation 2 argues that most people supported the regime. They may have used a source such as source C because it shows a crowd enthusiastically welcoming Hitler. So we've said they give different views because they've given weight to different sources, and then we prove it. So we're going to repeat ourselves. What does the writer of Interpretation 1 argue? And what source have they used? What does the writer of Interpretation 2 argue? And what source do they use? So this feels repetitive because you will have already explained what the interpretations argue in question 3b. But remember, it doesn't matter if we're repetitive because every question is marked discreetly. Okay then, Year 11. So now for the big question, the question 3D. It's worth 16 marks and you also can pick up an extra 4 marks for spelling and grammar on this one. So it's well worth spending 2 minutes once you've finished checking through your work for spelling and grammar to see if you can pick up those extra marks. Now, this question will ask you how far you agree with interpretation 2 about whatever the topic of section B is. When you get this question, I want you to underline the interpretation in the question because it's really important that you start off with the right interpretation. Once you've done that, your job is to go through the interpretation in the question, so interpretation 2, and decide which bits of it you agree with. So I would start your response with, I partially agree with the view in interpretation 2. This means you're going to find parts of it that you can support. So I partially agree with the view in interpretation 2. It argues that. So for the third time in this paper, you're going to summarise the view of interpretation 2. And you will have already done that in questions 3b and 3c. Then you're going to write, it says. So you're going to bring in a quote. And again, you will have already looked at these interpretations twice, so you'll be very familiar with the quotes that you could use. You're then going to write, this is true. And you're going to support what the interpretation is saying with some own knowledge, with some context of the time. Once you've done that, you're then going to pull out a second part of the same interpretation. So you're going to write, the interpretation also argues, and put a quote in there. And again, you're going to say this is true, and you're going to write down why that might be true. Now at this point, it might feel repetitive because you might feel that you've put this information down earlier. However, that doesn't matter. If it's accurate, if it's relevant, include it. Now, once you've written down what bits of the interpretation you think are true, you can use your knowledge at this point to challenge interpretation 2. So to write down things that you don't agree with. So when we put that all together, we have, I partially agree with the view in interpretation 2. It argues that. It says, this is true, adding your own knowledge. The interpretation also argues that. This is true. And then if you can challenge it. However, and you would write down your information to challenge it. But you will notice that the question says, explain your answer using both interpretations and your knowledge. So we're now going to write a paragraph using interpretation 1. So the second part of your answer is going to start with, the view in interpretation 2 can also be challenged with interpretation 1. And then you're just going to repeat the structure. Interpretation 1 argues that, write it in your own words. You've done that for 3b and for 3c. It says, this is true. It also says, which is true. And then support it with contextual knowledge. And once you've done that, you then move on to a conclusion. And then the third section of your answer is a conclusion. Overall, I agree with the views in interpretation 2 and giving those reasons why, so summarising your overall view. So question 3D has 3 sections. The first section on the interpretation of the question, which is interpretation 2. The second section countering the argument using interpretation 1, and then your third section, an overall conclusion. And just remember that in each section you're going to write down the interpretation argues, summarise it in your own words, it says, make sure you bring in a quote, this is true, support it with your contextual knowledge, and then repeat it. It also argues, it says, this is true because, and then if you know any reasons why it's not entirely accurate or you can challenge it, then you bring them in. And then afterwards you do your conclusion. So you're going to spend about 30 minutes on this question. Really take your time. It should be quite detailed. You should have quotes in it, and it's a chance to really show off any knowledge about Germany that you think is relevant. It might feel a little bit repetitive because you might have used that same knowledge in question 3A for the utility question. That doesn't matter, and we would expect that to some extent because it is about the same topic. So please don't worry if you feel as though you are repeating yourself. And then allow 2 minutes at the end just to go back through and check your spelling, punctuation and grammar. Good luck. And then finally, year 11, we come to content. So you already should know what content is going to be assessed in the mock tomorrow because you were given it in the mock preparation booklet. But just to remind you, it's going to be the reasons for the recovery of the Weimar Republic, growth in support for the Nazi Party, creation of a dictatorship and Nazi policies towards women. So on the screen in front of you, you've got the relevant page of the revision guide that you need to turn to. There are some questions in your mock preparation booklet as well that you need to answer. If you're unsure of where that booklet is, you can look on Arbor and it's saved up there for you. So those are the topics that are going to be assessed tomorrow. So making sure, please, that you have gone through those on the revision guide. And if you don't know where that is on Arbor.